before I start, I do want to say that from my position working sort of below the salt in genre and proud, that Lauren Bucas has made an enormous impression in the science fiction field with her two SF novels so far. I think the second one won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, if I recall correctly, a very prestigious British award. She's a superb writer. I haven't read anything about this book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So, forgive me for speaking from notes. My name is Patrick Nielsen Hayden. I'm a senior editor and the manager of science fiction and fantasy at Tor Books, which is kind of half of a company called Tom Doherty Associates, which is part of Macmillan. I wanted to start by observing that those of us who work in science fiction and fantasy sometimes feel that we've been comfortable with this whole social media thing for several more decades than everybody else. Here in 2013, it's kind of a truism to note that book publishers who so long treated booksellers as their actual customers and rarely interacted with actual human being readers are now being forced to do the opposite, to engage with a world full of actual readers who are determined to get into their face. But this has been going on in genre science fiction and fantasy publishing practically since its birth as a kind of pulp magazine publishing. Self-organized science fiction fandom, the world of SF conventions and fanzines, they invented the word fanzine, has been going on since about 1930. The fan-run World Science Fiction Convention started in 1939, started handing out the Hugo Award in 1952. Most of the significant science fiction and fantasy imprints, Ace Books, Ballantine, later Del Rey, Tor, Daw, have all been run and staffed by people who either came out of fandom or were very familiar with it. So we're kind of used to dealing with a self-organized network of enthusiasts who communicate among themselves with blinding speed and tremendous acuity, and we're reasonably used to going to conferences and hotels in faraway cities and having readers walk up to us and tell us which of our books are awesome and which ones suck. So, but in that said, it's always dangerous to expect the present to be just like the past. Blogs are not fanzines. The internet is not just fandom writ global, and there really are new things under the sun, so a little humility is called for, and I do try to keep that in mind. So yeah, we've been invited to say a few words about upcoming books that excite us. I have three. I'm going to talk about them in reverse chronological order, starting with the one that's farthest in the future, Jo Walton's What Makes This Book So Great, coming from Tor in January 2014. Jo Walton is kind of an epitome of the way that science fiction publishing and the social fanish world of science fiction overlap and intersect. I first became aware of her existence in the mid-1990s when the Usenet RecArts SF newsgroups, anyone here remember Usenet newsgroups, were flourishing. I began to notice that one of the most frequent contributors was this remarkably intelligent Jo Walton person whose commentary on everything, recent SF books, older SF books, even just daily trivia, was consistently brilliant, elegant, well-written, just stunningly good. And after a while I got curious and I clicked on the personal URL that was at the bottom of all of her posts. And was initially a bit dismayed to see that it went to a website full of amateur poetry, and then I was absolutely stunned by the fact that it was incredibly good amateur poetry. So, long story short, I did what editors supposedly never do. I sent her email out of the blue saying, "Do you write fiction? Because if you do, I'd really like to see it." And even longer story short, we published her first novel in the year 2000. She won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer in 2002. She won the World Fantasy Award for her novel Tooth and Claw in 2004. And last year, her novel, among others, won Science Fiction's Hugo and Nebula Awards. So a reasonably successful start. Now, among others, was a fantasy novel about, among other things, the experience of being a precocious teenager in the 1970s who's busy rewiring her own brain by reading the classics of modern science fiction and fantasy. So it's a novel that's full of discussions of Samuel R. Delany and Robert A. Heinlein and Ursula K. Le Guin and so forth. It's a novel full of articulate and sometimes naive, the main character is a teenager, chat about big daunting books and big daunting ideas that she's encountering for the first time. This new book, What Makes This Book So Great, is another book about books, but it's an essay collection. Since 2008, Jo has been writing a regular series of posts to Tor.com, which is our big reader-facing website full of science fiction news and commentary, original fiction and art. This series of posts has not been about newly published fantasy and science fiction, but rather about the books that Jo is rereading. It's been a huge hit. It's provoked some of the best reader commentary that's appeared on the site. So it's kind of a natural for us to collect some of the best from that first few years of the series into a single volume, and that's what this is. Jo rereads and reflects on a big range of work, ranging from old-school canonical classics like Heinlein, Niven, Clarke, through more modern writers like Connie Willis, Susanna Clarke. There are multi-part essay series in which she rereads and discusses entire long series like Lois McMaster Bujold's Miles Barkosigan series and Stephen Bruce Vlad Telzer series. And there are some outstanding essays about the various aspects of rereading itself, such as the experience of coming back to a favorite novel from one's youth and discovering that in the meantime somebody has snuck into it and added piles of racism and sexism and homophobia. Joe calls this phenomenon the suck fairy. Oh no, it's a terrific book, both as an introduction or a reintroduction to some of the classics of modern fantasy and SF, and also as a visit to the extremely well-furnished and fascinating mind of Joe Walton. The second book I want to talk about, only briefly, because we've been enjoying to avoid product pitches, and this might qualify. This is a big, fat, 250,000-word reprint anthology presenting representative short science fiction by about 36 of the writers who've come to prominence since the turn of the century. And it's called, naturally, 21st Century Science Fiction. It's coming from Tor in November, and it's co-edited by the very distinguished editor David G. Hartwell and me. And the third book is one we'll actually be giving out ARCs of from our booth. I think at 3:30 on Thursday. The Macmillan booth is 1557. It's a September 2014 tour title called The Incrementalists by best-selling fantasy author Stephen Brust in collaboration with a little-known but very talented up-and-comer named Skylar White. Yes, spelled just like Walter White's wife in Breaking Bad. It's not her fault. The Incrementalists are a secret society of about 200 people with a lineage reaching back 40,000 years. They cheat death, they have a complicated magical system of self-reincarnation, they share lives and memories, and they communicate with each other across nations and vast swaths of time. They have an epic history, a kind of magical memory, and a very modest mission, thus their name, to make the world a little bit better, a little bit at a time. And their ongoing argument about just how to accomplish this, how to use the powers they've evolved by being incredibly long-lived, is the argument itself is older than most of their individual memories. The system involves the real techniques of gamblers, pickpockets, magicians, alertness for tells, manipulation of sense input, refined as it would be by people who live an incredibly long time. It's beautifully done. It's almost impossible to tell where the real ends and the fantastic begins. The actual story is set in present-day Las Vegas, where Phil, whose personality has stayed stable through more incarnations than anybody else's, goes back to about the 1st century BC, currently works as a professional poker player. He has loved his fellow incrementalist, Celeste, and argued with her and fought with her over multiple lifetimes over most of the last 400 years. Now, Celeste has recently died the real death, and in the process, embittered, very unstable, she's managed to change the rules of the magical system the incrementalists depend on. So now the core of the group has to gather in contemporary Las Vegas to save their own ancient secret society and possibly the world. It's a complicated and beguiling and wonderful book. It's a contemporary fantasy thriller, it's a love story, it's a supernatural procedural, if you will. And as more than one reader has observed, Stephen Brust does not know how to write a dull book. Let me just put it this way, every time I open the manuscript and have to check something, I wind up losing myself and reading 3 or 4 chapters, and I'm not the only person in our house who's done that. So I commend The Incrementalists by Stephen Brust and Skylar White. That's it for me.
Thank you. Great.